On a Friday morning in April of 1994, Mira Dunlap walked into an auction preview in Keokuk County, Iowa, and spent 4 minutes standing in front of a dead woman's sewing room before she said a single word to anyone. The listing in the county shopper had been brief. Sewing and needlework contents assorted on $175 takes all. That was it. No inventory, no description of what assorted meant. Just a number and a category that most people at that preview had walked past on their way to the furniture and the farm equipment and the kitchen goods, which were the things that sold at auctions in Keokuk County in the spring of 1994, because those were the things people understood the value of. Most people walked past. Not Mira. Let me tell you about Keokuk County in April of 1994, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what Mira was looking at when she stood in that sewing room. This was river country, East Iowa, the kind of terrain that flattens out toward the Mississippi and makes you feel the weight of winters that have been serious and long for a long time. The women who farmed here, and there were women who farmed here, ran households and kept books and raised children and made things. They made things with their hands in the particular way that people make things when the nearest store is 40 minutes away and the catalog takes 2 weeks and the budget doesn't stretch far enough anyway. They quilted, they sewed, they embroidered. They did handwork of a kind that was already becoming rare by 1994, that required tools most people had never heard of and techniques that weren't being taught anywhere anymore except by women who had learned them from women who were already old. The woman whose sewing room this had been was named Dorothea Kessler. She was 83 years old when she died in February of that year, and she had lived on the same 40 acres south of Wat Cheer for 51 years. She had no daughters. Her son, a man named Gary, who lived in Des Moines and worked in commercial real estate, had come to the farm twice since her death, once to sign papers and once to arrange the auction. He had walked through the sewing room both times without stopping. He had told the auction company to price it as a lot because there was too much of it. And none of it was worth pricing individually. The auction company had sent a woman named Brenda to do the assessment. Brenda had been running estate sales in a 3-county area for 9 years and was competent in the way that people are competent when their competence has clear limits they've never been asked to exceed. She knew fabric. She knew what a sewing machine was worth. She'd looked at Dorothea Kessler's sewing room and seen a lot of thread and a lot of old patterns and a wooden cabinet full of things she couldn't name, and she had priced the entire room at $175 because it was enough to make the line item look real and not so much that it would scare off the church ladies and the Quilters Guild members she expected would be the most likely buyers. That's not who bought it. Let me tell you about Mira Dunlap, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she saw. Mira was 48 years old in 1994. She had grown up in Davis County, the daughter of a woman named Esther, who had spent 30 years teaching home economics at the county high school before the school district decided. Home economics was no longer a necessary subject, which happened in 1981, and which Esther had regarded as a civilizational error she declined to accept personally. Esther had kept teaching, not at the school, at the kitchen table and in the basement workroom and at the 4-H meetings she ran for 12 years after her retirement, and she had taught Mira the way a person teaches a child when they believe the knowledge is worth preserving past their own lifetime. What Esther had taught was not just sewing. It was textile work in the older sense, the full tradition of it, the thread crafts and the needle crafts and the cutting and the fitting and the construction techniques that went back to a time before patterns came in envelopes with instructions printed in 3 languages. She had taught Mira to read a piece of cloth the way other mothers taught their daughters to read music. Not just to follow what was written, but to understand what the notation meant and what the instrument could do and what it was designed to say. Mira had taken that knowledge and spent 22 years adding to it. She had corresponded with textile historians at university extension programs and with collectors of antique needlework tools in Illinois and Pennsylvania, and with two women in England, who were considered authorities on pre-industrial handwork traditions. She had handled tens of thousands of needles and thimbles and stilettos and thread winders, and tatting shuttles and embroidery frames in antique shops and at farm sales and in the back rooms of estate houses. She had never published anything. She had never taught a class. She ran a small alterations and tailoring business out of a room in her farmhouse, and she attended estate sales in a 7-county area as a hobby that most people assumed was about finding cheap fabric. It was not about finding cheap fabric. Brenda certainly didn't know that. Brenda had priced the room at $175, and she was sitting at a card table in the kitchen when Mira walked in on Friday morning, and she nodded at Mira the way auctioneers nod, at people they've categorized, which is to say, in a way that doesn't require any further attention. Let me tell you about what was in Dorothea Kessler's sewing room, because this is where the story starts to be about something. The room was small, 10 by 12, south-facing window, the light coming in flat, and even in the way that light comes through old glass in a farmhouse that hasn't been renovated since the 1950s. There was a treadle sewing machine against one wall that was clearly a Singer, and clearly old, and clearly not what Mira had come to look at. Against the opposite wall was the wooden cabinet Brenda had catalogued as miscellaneous. And on the table in the center of the room were 3 wooden cases that had been stacked and covered with a cloth that Brenda had not removed because she'd assumed it was fabric. Mira removed it. The cases were of different sizes, each dovetailed at the corners in the manner of pre-war American craft production, and each fitted with brass hardware that had been kept clean. The largest case held an embroidery frame and its components, the webbing, the frame bars, the wing nuts, the separate roller assembly, and the frame itself, when Mira lifted it out, bore a maker's mark that made her go very still. She set the frame down. She picked up the second case. The second case held needles, not a packet of needles, not a drawer of needles. A fitted case with individual compartments, each holding a type, each labeled in a handwriting that Mira recognized immediately as someone who had organized this room not for convenience, but for permanence. There were chenille needles and crewel needles and tapestry needles, and a set of needles with curved shafts that Mira had read about in a monograph from 1947 and never seen in person. And there was a set of what she believed, from the case and the finish and the length, to be gold-plated embroidery needles of the type made by a Sheffield firm that had closed in 1938, which would have made them pre-war English manufacture, which was something she needed to confirm, but believed she was confirming correctly. She set the second case down. She opened the wooden cabinet. The cabinet held on its shelves a collection of tatting shuttles in sizes and materials that Mira had not expected to find outside of a museum case in Philadelphia. There were bone shuttles and celluloid shuttles, and a set of what she recognized as ivory shuttles from before the trade restrictions, which would have made them pre-1900. There was a tatting needle set that bore the name of a manufacturer she had only encountered in a 1923 catalog. And on the bottom shelf, wrapped in a cloth that had clearly been changed regularly and not allowed to mildew, was a set of silk winding bobbins in a tray that bore the crest of a Pennsylvania silk mill that had been absorbed into a conglomerate in 1929 and whose original branded accessories she knew from a conversation with a collector in Lancaster, were considered effectively extinct in original condition. Mira stood in front of the cabinet for a moment. Then she went to the card table in the kitchen where Brenda was drinking her coffee and working through a checklist. Mira said, "I'll take the sewing room." Brenda looked up. "$175. That's everything." "I know," Mira said. "I'll take it." Brenda wrote it down and took Mira's check and went back to her checklist. It took Mira 3 hours to pack the room properly. She had brought tissue and archival boxes and muslin bags of the kind you bring when you know what you're going to find, or when you're hoping you do, and she used all of them. She packed each case with care and each shuttle in its own wrapping, and she was still in the sewing room when the rest of the auction had closed and the furniture buyers had loaded their trucks, and Gary Kessler had called from Des Moines to confirm that everything had sold. Brenda came in to check on her at the end. She looked at the archival boxes, at the tissue paper, at the care with which Mira was wrapping the last of the bobbins. "You a collector?" Brenda asked. Mira said, "Something like that." Brenda nodded. "Old stuff. You never know." She went out. Mira finished packing. "Now let me pause here and ask you something. What do you think Brenda believed she had sold that morning?" She believed she had moved a sewing room full of old needlework supplies to a collector or a hobbyist, and she had gotten $175 for it, which was what she'd priced it at, which meant the transaction had gone exactly as anticipated, which in her business meant the morning had been a success. She had no reason to look further into it. She had assessed the room. She had priced it. The system had worked. The system had also just transferred something in the neighborhood of $12,000 to $18,000 from a dead woman's estate to the one person in a 7-county area who understood what had been kept in that cabinet. Let me tell you about what Mira found when she brought the boxes home and began going through them on her workroom table. She worked the way her mother had taught her to work, which was methodically, and she worked for the better part of 2 weeks, handling each piece under the adjustable lamp she had set up for exactly this purpose, consulting the reference books and correspondence files she had accumulated over 2 decades, writing notes in a composition book in her small, deliberate handwriting. The embroidery frame was from a Pennsylvania firm that had operated between 1901 and 1933. It was not the most valuable piece in the room, but it was the piece that told Mira something important about Dorothea Kessler, because the frame had been maintained. Not preserved in the way you preserve something you don't intend to use. Maintained in the way you maintain a tool you use regularly and intend to go on using, which meant that Dorothea Kessler had used this frame, had kept it in working condition, had cared for it not because it was old, but because it was good. That told Mira the rest of what she needed to know about the other things in the room before she had even finished examining them. The Sheffield needles were confirmed on the second day by the stamp on the case, which matched a photograph in a correspondence file from a collector in Shrewsbury who had spent 20 years documenting pre-war English needle manufacture. They were made between 1934 and 1937, the last production years of the firm before it was liquidated. The gold plating was intact. The needles had never been used, which was not a defect, but an indication of what Dorothea Kessler had understood about them, which was that some things are kept because they represent something about what was possible, about the standard a craft could reach. The ivory tatting shuttles were older than Mira had initially estimated. The patina on the material and the specific profile of the center post, which had changed in the 1880s when manufacturing techniques shifted, put them closer to 1870 than 1900. She sat with them for a long time on the third evening, turning them under the lamp, thinking about the hands they had passed through before they came to Dorothea Kessler, and before they came to Mira, and about what it meant that they were in this condition in a farmhouse in Keokuk County, Iowa, wrapped in a cloth that had been changed recently enough that there was no mildew and no compression damage. Someone had been taking care of these things. Someone had understood they were worth taking care of. And that person was gone now, with a son in Des Moines who worked in commercial real estate and had walked through this room twice without stopping. Mira thought about that. The bobbin set from the Pennsylvania mill was the piece she spent the most time with, because it was the piece she was least prepared for. She had known the mill by name and by catalog. She had not known that branded bobbins in original trays had survived, and when she finished her examination and wrote the number in her composition book, she looked at it for a long moment and then closed the book and sat in her workroom in the dark for a while before she turned the lamp back on. The total appraised value of what Mira Dunlap had purchased for $175 was, by the conservative estimate she assembled over 3 weeks of careful work and 2 long phone calls, with an appraiser in Chicago who specialized in textile antiques, somewhere between $14,000 and $19,000. That was 1994 money. That was the figure based on comparable sales at specialty houses in Philadelphia and New York, and on what the appraiser told her about the current market for pre-war English needle manufacture, and on what she already knew from her own 20 years of attention to a field that almost no one else in Iowa was paying attention to. $14,000 to $19,000 for 175. Now let me tell you about what Mira did with this, because this is the part that most people get wrong when they hear this kind of story. She did not sell most of it. She kept the embroidery frame because she used it, the same reason she kept the Sheffield needles and the tatting shuttles she could work with, and the bobbin winder that fit the thread she still used for fine handwork. A tool that is kept in a cabinet is not a tool. It is a shape. The idea inside it is still frozen. Mira had learned this from Esther, who had learned it from working in a way that didn't allow you to separate the knowing from the doing. What she sold over the following year, through the appraiser in Chicago and through 2 dealers in Pennsylvania she had been corresponding with for a decade, was the material she had no working use for. The ivory shuttles, the pre-war celluloid set, 2 of the needle cases she couldn't use and knew better than to try to use. She sold them carefully, 1 piece at a time, and she used the money to replace the treadle machine in her own workroom with a restored industrial machine she had been trying to afford for 8 years. She told her friend Lucia about it 6 months after the sale, over coffee on a Saturday morning at Lucia's kitchen table. Lucia was the only person Mira knew who would have understood any of it, and even Lucia did not understand all of it. Lucia said, "What did Brenda say when she heard?" Mira said, "I don't know that she heard." Lucia said, "Do you think she'd want to?" Mira thought about it. "I think she'd want to have priced it differently," she said. "I don't know that she'd want to understand why she couldn't." That distinction mattered to Mira. It was the kind of distinction her mother had made between knowing how to do something and knowing why it was done, between the procedure and the understanding underneath the procedure. Brenda did hear eventually. It was the following winter at a consignment sale in Washington County, and it came through the usual route that awkward information travels, which is through someone who mentions it casually in a way that is not casual at all. Brenda heard the broad outline of what had been in Dorothea Kessler's sewing room and what Mira had paid for it. Her face went through several adjustments before settling on something that was trying to be professional. She looked at Mira and said, "You knew what was in that cabinet when you walked in." Mira said, "I had a pretty good idea." Brenda said, "You should have told me." Mira looked at her for a moment. "You priced it," she said. "That's your job. I paid the price. That's mine." Brenda didn't have an answer for that. She moved on to look at some furniture, and Mira watched her go, and then went back to the display she had come to see. Now let me ask you something, because this is the moment the story turns on. Was Mira wrong? She had paid the asking price. She had not deceived anyone. She had not misrepresented herself or what was in the room. She had simply known something that Brenda didn't know, and she had acted on that knowledge, which is what knowledge is for. The auction system works on the understanding that the seller prices what they have and the buyer decides whether to pay it, and both parties are responsible for understanding what they are dealing with. Mira had held up her side of that with a precision that 22 years of deliberate study had made possible. Brenda had held up her side with a 20-minute assessment and a number that felt reasonable. The question the story asks is not whether Mira was wrong. The question is what that gap represents. Between what Brenda saw in 10 minutes and what Mira saw in 4 minutes of standing still. Between $175 and $14,000 to $19,000. And who is responsible for it, and what it means that the gap exists, and whether it has to stay that way. Mira's answer, which she never stated directly but which you can read in what she did next, was that the gap was the exact size and shape of a lifetime of attention. And that attention was not luck, it was not instinct, it was work, deliberate, daily, unglamorous work, conducted without any particular audience or reward. In the back rooms of antique shops and in correspondence files, and in the hours she spent in her workroom with her hands on actual objects learning what they were. The gap was 40,000 hours of looking at things carefully. Let me tell you about what happened with the embroidery frame. Mira used it in her workroom for the following 11 years. She used it the way Dorothea Kessler had clearly used it, which was correctly and consistently, and with the full understanding of what the tool could do that most people who might have heard of it didn't have. An embroidery frame of this type, a floor-standing, tension-adjustable frame with the specific engineering of the pre-war Pennsylvania production, is not a display piece. It is a precision instrument for a precision craft. It allows the worker to maintain even tension across a ground fabric while working from both sides, which changes what is possible in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has not done the work. Most people who encountered surviving frames of this type kept them in display cases. Mira worked with hers every week. The pieces she made during those 11 years using the Pennsylvania frame became identifiable to the small number of people who knew textile work at that level. Not because she marked them differently, but because the evenness of the ground tension produced a result that was recognizable if you knew what to look for. In 2005, Mira's niece, a woman named June Aldrich, 27 years old and newly out of a design program in Chicago, came home for a family visit and sat in Mira's workroom for most of an afternoon watching her work. At the end of it, she asked about the frame, not where it had come from. She knew the Kessler story. She asked what made it worth using rather than preserving. Mira thought about how to answer. Then she said, "A tool you're afraid to use is a tool that's already stopped working. The idea in it is still frozen." June thought about that. She was not a needleworker. She was a designer, and she thought in different terms. But she recognized what her aunt was saying because it was about the same thing her program had tried and mostly failed to teach, which was the difference between understanding a craft and treating it as an artifact. She started spending weekends at Mira's workroom that fall. She came most weekends for the following 2 years, not to learn embroidery specifically, though she learned some of that, but to learn how Mira looked at things, how she held a piece to the light, how she read a seam, how she moved from not knowing what something was to knowing, which was a process that could not be rushed and could not be shortcutted, and which most people, when they encountered it, either respected or walked past the same way they walked past a sewing room, listed as assorted at $175. Let me tell you about what June found at an estate sale in Story County, Iowa, in the fall of 2007, because the story does not end with Mira. The sale was at a farmstead outside Nevada, the property of a retired home economics teacher named Frances Whitmore, who had died at 79, and whose family had hired the same auction company that had run the Kessler sale 13 years earlier, now under different management but with the same fundamental approach to pricing. The auction company had priced a cedar chest in the back bedroom at $60 because it was old and the tray insert was missing and the latch was stiff. June opened the chest. She looked at Mira, who was standing next to her. Mira looked at the chest. She looked at what was in the chest. She looked at the cedar lining, which was intact, and at the way the folded pieces on top had been wrapped in muslin before being stored, which told her something specific about the person who had used this chest. She lifted the top piece and looked at the work. It was a quilt top, unfinished, in a pattern Mira did not immediately recognize. She turned it to the light. She looked at the piecings. She looked at the fabric, which was not the kind of fabric that came from a bolt in a store in 1980 or 1990 or 2000. She looked at the weight and the hand of it, and she looked at the dye patterns, and then she looked at the seam allowances, and she set the quilt top down very carefully. The fabrics in this quilt top were not reproduction fabrics. They were period fabrics, mid-19th century, several of them, the kind of fabrics that came out of collections, or out of estates of collectors, or out of the work boxes of women who had been piecing from inherited materials for so long that they themselves might not have known what they had. June said, $60. Mira said, $60. June paid the $60. She did not ask Mira what the chest might be worth because she already knew enough to know that asking that question before she understood more would be answering it wrong. She spent the following 6 months learning what she had. She consulted a textile conservator in Ames and a quilt historian at Iowa State and sent photographs to 2 dealers in the antique quilt market in New York. The quilt top was incomplete, which limited its value in one direction. The fabrics were authentic period cloth, which expanded its value in another. The final estimate she received from a specialist appraiser in Cincinnati was between $4,000 and $7,000 for the chest contents as a textile collection, with significant uncertainty depending on provenance and buyer. That was $60. Mira called the auction company after the appraisal, not to complain. She had paid what was asked. She called because she wanted to speak to whoever had priced the chest, and when she reached the woman who had done the assessment, she said only that she thought it might be worth the company's time to call her before pricing textile items at future sales in the county, that she would come and look without charge and tell them what she thought they had. The woman said she would pass the message along. Mira was not certain she would, but she had said it, and that was what she could do from her position, which was the position of a person who knew something and was trying to make the knowing useful beyond herself. She had thought about Dorothea Kessler while she made that phone call. She had thought about a woman who had spent decades collecting and maintaining objects of real quality and craft, who had wrapped them in clean cloth and replaced the cloth regularly and kept them in a room that faced south for the light, and who had died with a son in Des Moines who had walked through the room twice without stopping. She had thought about what that cost, not in money, but in the other kind. The way a life of careful attention can simply end without transmission. The way a room full of knowledge can be reduced to a line in a county shopper. She had promised herself, while she was thinking about Dorothea Kessler, that she would not let that happen to what she knew. Let me tell you about the call Mira received in the winter of 2011, because this is where the story becomes about something larger than a transaction. It was from a woman named Bet, who ran the estate liquidation practice for a firm in Cedar Rapids, and who had heard, through a connection Mira had never been able to trace, that there was a woman in Davis County who knew things about old textiles that no one else in the state knew. Bet had a client. The client had a farmstead outside Tipton that had belonged to a woman named Lois, deceased, who had for 40 years been something of a known figure in the quilt history community, though Bet used the phrase without being sure what it meant, and who had left behind a studio full of material that the family could not assess. Mira drove to Tipton on a Thursday. She spent 3 hours in the studio. She came out and found Bet standing by her car with a notepad. Bet said, "What do you think?" Mira said, "I think you should have a proper appraiser before you put a number on any of this," Bet said. "That's why I called you." Mira said, "I'm not an appraiser, I'm a needleworker." "If you want an appraiser, I can give you a name. She's in Iowa City. She can be here by next week if you tell her what you have." Bet looked at her notepad. "The family wants to move the property by the end of February," Mira said. "Then call her today." Bet called. The appraiser came. The studio contents were assessed at $31,000, which was $31,000, more than Bet had been prepared to put in the listing. The family sold through a specialty auction in Chicago 8 months later and received $24,000 after commission, which went to Lois's daughter in Iowa City, who had not known her mother's things were worth $24,000 and who sat for a long time without speaking when she heard the number. Bet called Mira after the sale closed. She said, "You could have offered to buy it yourself." Mira said, "I know," Bet said. "Why didn't you?" Mira said, "Because knowing what something is worth isn't the same as being entitled to take advantage of people who don't. I learned what I know from women who gave it to me. That means something." There was a long pause on the phone. Then Bet said, "I've been thinking about the Kessler sale." Mira said, "I know." Bet said, "The woman who priced that room, she's retired now, but the way it was priced." Mira said, "She priced what she saw. She saw what she knew how to see." Bet said, "How do I learn to see more?" Mira said, "That's a different conversation. Come by on Saturday." Bet came on Saturday. She came the following Saturday. She came most Saturdays for the next 18 months, and what happened in those Saturdays was not a curriculum. It was not a lesson plan. It was something more like what had happened between Esther and Mira 40 years earlier, which was the slow passing of a way of seeing from one person to another through proximity and handling and the time that it takes to really look at something. Bet did not become Mira. That was not possible and was not the point. But she became a woman who could walk into a sewing room and know that she did not know what she was seeing, which is where all real looking begins. She started calling the appraiser in Iowa City before pricing textile items. She started asking questions she had not known to ask. She started reading the organization of a room, the way things were stored, the care with which they had been wrapped, the facing of a window, as information about the person who had kept them, which was what Mira had been doing since 1994. Let me tell you about the last estate sale Mira attended, because the story ends there, and it ends the way the best stories end, which is with something that was almost lost becoming something that continues. It was June of 2018. Mira was 72. Her hip had been difficult since the previous winter, and June had driven her, which Mira had agreed to in the way that a person agrees to something they have decided not to argue about. The sale was at a farmstead outside Bloomfield, Davis County, 3 miles from where Mira had grown up. The property had belonged to a woman named Clara Fenstermacher, 91 years old, who had in her working life been a seamstress and alteration specialist, and who had maintained a workroom that her family, 3 grandchildren who lived in Minneapolis and had not been to Davis County in several years, had no capacity to assess. June walked into the workroom first. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then stepped back and let Mira in. Mira stood in the room. She stood there for a long time. Then she said, "You see the thimble tray?" June said she did, the silver ones on the left end. June looked at them. She looked at the markings on the side of the tray. Mira said, "Those are English hallmarked. Chester Assay Office. I'd put them at 1890s to 1910. I've handled one of those in 30 years." They stood there for a moment in the light from the south window, in a room that smelled of cedar and old cloth and the specific cleanness of a room that has been cared for a very long time. June said, "What do you want to do?" Mira said, "I want to buy the thimble tray and the tatting frame in the corner and the thread cabinet against the wall, and I want the rest of it to go to someone who can tell the family what they have." June said, "Bet has a contact at a textile auction in Chicago." Mira said, "Call her." June called Bet from the parking lot while Mira went in and bought the thimble tray and the tatting frame and the thread cabinet for a combined $340, which was not the price of ignorance this time. The grandchildren had spoken to an appraiser the previous week, on Bet's recommendation, who had assessed those items specifically at $380 and priced them accordingly. The remaining contents of Clara Fenstermacher's workroom sold through the Chicago house the following spring and brought $11,000 to the 3 grandchildren in Minneapolis, who had not known their grandmother's things were worth $11,000. The oldest one called Bet when the check arrived and asked who had suggested the appraiser. Bet told her. The granddaughter called Mira. She didn't say much. She said she wished she had known her grandmother better. She said she hadn't understood, when she was young, what her grandmother did in that room for all those years. Mira said she was keeping something alive. Mira drove home from Bloomfield with the thimble tray on the seat beside her, wrapped in muslin, the way she had wrapped Dorothea Kessler's shuttles 24 years earlier. She drove home in the long summer evening with the windows down and got home while it was still light and set the tray on her workbench and looked at the thimbles under the lamp. June called later that night and asked how she was feeling. Mira said she was fine. June said, "You going to use them?" Mira said some of them, the right size. June said, "Mom was asking if you'd thought any more about putting together some kind of reference for the auction people, something they could actually use in the field." Mira didn't answer right away. She sat in her workroom in the same house where Esther had taught her to read cloth 40 years ago, and she thought about Dorothea Kessler, and she thought about Clara Fenstermacher, and she thought about all the women in all the farmhouses in all the river counties of Iowa who had spent their lives making things with their hands, with tools of real quality, and keeping those tools in good order and dying without anyone in the family who knew what was in the cabinet. She said, "I've been thinking about it for a long time." June said, "I could help. I know people in the design archive programs. We could make it visual, something you could actually use in the field, not just read in an office." Mira said, "You'd need real photographs, good light, and access to the reference collections in Iowa City." June said, "I've already made a call." There was a long pause. Mira said, "Then I suppose we should start." They started that fall. It took 3 years, and it was not a glossy publication, and it was not a website, though eventually it became both of those things. It started as a laminated field guide, spiral-bound, distributed through the estate sale professional associations in Iowa and Illinois and Missouri. It had photographs of makers' marks and hallmarks, and the specific visual characteristics that allowed a person who was willing to look carefully to distinguish a working tool from a decorative reproduction, a pre-war piece from a post-war one, an object of real craft from an object of apparent age. Bet helped distribute it. She sent copies to every estate sale operator she knew in 4 states and included a letter that said the guide had been made by a woman who had spent a lifetime knowing what most people didn't know, and that the least any of them could do was learn enough to stop walking past the rooms they couldn't price. The guide is still in use. June has added to it twice since Mira's death in 2022, expanding the textile sections and adding new material on the tools of specific women's trades that are disappearing faster than anyone is tracking. Tatters, smockers, the lace makers of specific regional traditions, whose workrooms are being sold off every year to families who have no way of knowing what they are inheriting. The current edition has a dedication on the inside cover, below the title, in June's handwriting. It reads, "For Dorothea Kessler, who kept the work alive in a room no one else stopped to enter." The Pennsylvania embroidery frame is in June's studio in Iowa City. She uses it. The Chester Hallmark thimbles are on the shelf above her workbench. She uses the right size, the way Mira said, and somewhere in a farmhouse in a river county of Iowa or Illinois or Missouri, there is a room that faces south for the light, with a cabinet against the wall and cases on the table and a cloth laid over them that has been changed recently enough that there is no mildew and no damage, and everything is exactly as it was left by the person who knew what it was. It is waiting for someone who will stop.